Well, hello and welcome, everybody. This is Bart Poulson, and today I have my special guest here, Lisa Poulson.
Hello.
And we are here. Well, I guess I should address something very quickly off the bat. We are related. We have the name. Lisa is my big sister, and I am the little brother, but we both work around the tech industry. I teach people how to work with data, and Lisa is a professional communications consultant. I'll let you introduce yourself in just a second.
All right.
Um, but we've got half an hour here to talk to you about storytelling and how that relates to people who are presenting to others and how it relates specifically to talking about data work. So the goal here is to take some of these skills that Lisa has in her professional coaching practice and make it useful so you can have more impact with your own data work. Now, I want to do something before we get started. Well, I'm Bart Poulson, and I am in Salt Lake City, Utah, and it's 1 p.m. for me. And Lisa, why don't you take just a minute or two to introduce yourself, and then we'll have people say hello to where they are from.
Hi, I'm Lisa Poulson. I'm a communications coach. I was a PR person in tech, mostly software, for about 25 years. I'm in San Francisco, and I've been doing this communications coaching for about 10 and a half years now. And I spend a lot of time helping people learn how to use stories well in keynote speeches, media interviews, all hands meetings, all of the above.
And what I would like now is those of you who are logged in, I would love it if you could say hello in the comments and tell us where you're from. And as we go through this session, Lisa will be presenting. I will be adding in, and then we invite you to contribute your own comments as we go through. So please, if you're there, say hello and tell us where you're from. And so our first one here, Kimberly in Atlanta, thank you for joining us.
Nice glasses, Kimberly.
And Shanna in Calgary, thank you for coming. And I imagine there will be others checking in momentarily. But if you got a minute, get in the comments, say hello. We have Tina from Denmark, and we have our user from Vancouver, but a San Francisco native, and Dylan in Montreal.
And Chica from Nigeria.
Oh, I'm sorry. Chica, thank you so much for joining us. I love that we haven't, right now we only have like 8 people, but they're already from all around the world. And
great.
Michael from Accra and Okoro from Newcastle and Teresa from the Czech Republic and Jen all the way from across the Bay. Yeah. And Latasha. Oh, folks, thank you so much for joining us. Also, you know that we record these sessions and they'll be available as recordings almost immediately on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook when we're done. And so you'll have more opportunities there. But Lisa, let's have you start. We're going to share your presentation. You can get started, and she'll be presenting, I'll be commenting, and we would love to hear from you in the comments as well as we go through. Yeah. So I will now turn off that banner, and we will hand over the presentation.
So the thing that I love about stories is there actually is a formula. And now, and this is stuff that Joseph Campbell, he was born in 1918, I believe. He's the guy who wrote this book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, spent his whole life studying different story structures from mythology, oral traditions, cave paintings, theater, novels. And he found that there's a similar structure all over the world. Fairy tales, problem, good and evil, magic, a moral. Story patterns, the thing that I find most fascinating is that these story patterns, our brains recognize them. And when we hear a story, our brains release hormones that get us engaged. And we dip into the place the protagonist is, and we can't stop paying attention. So there's something really powerful in what stories can do for us. Stories also, and I think this is the most important for remembering data. Stories help us remember things. There are big studies and small studies. One tiny study done at Stanford was just in a graduate seminar, asking students to remember a string of numbers. And they remembered it about 25–40% of the time. And then you ask them to remember the string of numbers in the context of a story, and their memory doubled. So there's something about dropping information into the context of what a story does for our brains that really helps us remember. And that's why I think story is so great for people who work with data. Neurobiology is kind of fascinating how our brains recognize and reward us for patterns. So your amygdala, which is right there in the center of your brain, its job is to determine whether you are following a pattern that it likes. And then it tells your adrenal glands to give you a shot of a happy hormone. If you're following a pattern it doesn't like, it tells your brain to give you a shot of cortisol. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the pattern of stories. I don't know if any of you have babies, but even a 6-month-old child will sit down next to you when you pull out a book because they're excited that it's story time. We as adults feel the same way when we sit down in a movie or a theater to see a play. We have a burst of dopamine when story's coming because our brain recognizes the pattern and knows we're going to learn something good. Then, because story puts us into the skin of the protagonist, when the hero is in trouble, our brain releases cortisol, the same stress hormone we would release if we were in trouble. And then oxytocin when we hear the happy ending of the story. Now, I've worked in the tech industry my whole life. And if you want to persuade a new customer to buy something, the best way to do it is to tell them about some horrible problem another customer had that your wonderful product solves. Because when they hear about that horrible problem the other customer had, they get a sense of cortisol. They're like, oh my gosh, I remember what that was like. And they feel stressed. And then they want that feeling of a happy ending. They want to be excited. Pixar's story structure is classic. There are some great books about it. And this is another version. I have a wonderful colleague named Jay Golden. He wrote a book called Retellable. This is close to Pixar. Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey story model, for anyone who wants to dive really deep, it has 23 steps, the hero's journey, but this is a 7-step model. So just here's a person sitting at their desk. Let's call her Beatrice. She's just sitting there. And one day Beatrice's boss comes to her and says, Beatrice, we just bought 4 new companies this year, as you know, but the only way that we're going to justify that expense is if we can really drive some insights from all the data of those 4 companies. And Beatrice is like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be in charge of this project. So then Beatrice starts to set out on how she's going to integrate data from all these 4 companies. And there are 27 different languages that the data is in. There's video data, there's unstructured data, there's text data, there's data that's messed up, that's 27 years old, that was on a mainframe. And finally, after all this investigation and all these meetings, poor Beatrice is sitting there and she's like, it's 11 o'clock at night. She's in her office. She's having to wave her arms to make the lights go on. And she's like, I had no idea what a disaster this was going to be. This is impossible. I'm going to fail. I should just update my LinkedIn right now because I'm done. That is the problem. That's a hero who is really facing a problem. And then the other thing that a story always has is change. So finally, Beatrice remembers something and she reaches out and she gets help. And the next slide, we're going to talk about what that help looks like and where it comes from. So she has magical elements. She finds a way to use the data differently. She finds wonderful software. She finds a guide who helps her figure out how to use the software and the data to derive the insights that are the right insight to the situation that the business is in. Yay, she climbs out of the problem. She's now the person who has integrated successfully the data from 4 different acquisitions, and she gets to go on the circuit at industry conferences and tell everyone how she did it. And she's a genius, and she gets a big raise, and she gets to buy a cabin. Yay! Happy ending
So
for
Lisa,
yes.
I'm going to jump into this, and I'm imagining any of you who have worked with data that involved more than one source or more than one person contributing to it have had this problem. You know the rule of thumb in the data world that 80% of the time on any project is spent preparing the data. I've mentioned before a data service event I do called the Data Charrette, and we'll be doing it. Look, there's the address. We're going to be doing a version of this. It's where we pair up with local nonprofits and we get a bunch of volunteers to work with their data, and we get insights in a day or two. And I remember one charrette, we were working with a very simple problem, but these were not big data sets. They were spreadsheet based, but we had 4 people working on it at the same time, and they were all coding dates differently because they did not take the time to create a little code book, because I thought, this is a tiny project. We're all sitting next to each other. What could possibly go wrong? And they spent hours coding the data differently. And so we had this small disaster, and they say, until finally we had one person whose name was Jen, who was a SQL expert, structured query language. And she was able to just kind of like, okay, everybody just back off for a moment. And she got all the data files, and she did about 5 or 10 minutes of SQL and got it all in a standardized format. And so for that little group working on that one project, she saved the day. By the way, any of you who've worked with this, you know that dates are tricky. I got myself in a weird situation when I was doing a presentation to a group a couple of years ago, because I did not know that in the UK, they write dates differently than in the US. And meaning they do day, month, year. We do month, day, year. Although if I'm doing anything official, I use the ISO format, which is year, month, day. But these little tiny things can cause enormous headaches. And this is why, for instance, I work in R, and I love the language. I love the tidyverse set of commands, and especially things like, there's a whole package, if you work with R, about Lubridate, which is simply for working with dates. And because it seems like something that shouldn't be there, but it makes your life hell until you find this little thing that fixes it, and you feel like the genius. So even working in dates and spreadsheets, you can go through this little hero's journey.
Yeah. Well, and I love, so there's always a problem. And we always wind up having to solve it ourselves, which is why I love this Raj Chast cartoon. But so we've talked about change. Who was the magical element? Who was the guide? The magical element was SQL, but the guide was this person, Jen. It was Jen, right? In your little charrette. So for each of you, you are probably going to be in situations where you're working with colleagues who need data to help get through and understand a problem. The data and the tools you use are the magical element, and then you're the guide that helps solve the problem so that the business can have insights.
And I'm sure all of you have also had these problems where it looks like one thing is happening at first, and then you suddenly realize it's not what's going on in the data world. So for instance, one of the built-in data sets in R is about the University of California at Berkeley Graduate School admissions, which led to a lawsuit in the early 70s. And maybe you guys are familiar with the Berkeley admissions situation. Very quickly, what happened is that people found that men were admitted at a higher rate than women were to graduate programs in Berkeley in early 70s. And this led to a sort of a class action gender discrimination lawsuit. And it was a very big deal. And Berkeley said, we had no idea this was going on, and we're going to go find who the offending programs are, and we're going to fix it. The problem is, when they went to individual programs, they no longer found the same pattern. And in fact, I don't know what the exact data was, but you can set up the data so that every single program actually has a higher percentage of female applicants accepted than male applicants, but still have a lower percentage of female applicants overall. This is an example in data of what's called Simpson's paradox. And what it has to do is if your groups differ in size, some of the graduate programs are much larger than others, and they have differing acceptance rates, and men and women apply to them in different percentages, you have these variables confounded with each other. If men are more likely to apply to programs that are very large and have higher acceptance rates, say, for instance, like a master's in engineering, and women are more likely to apply for much smaller programs with much lower acceptance rates, think, for instance, a PhD in comparative literature, this overall effect can happen. And so it became a question of what's going on here. We have the data, we're looking at the tools, and then we have this paradox that's showing up in it. Now, usually when people tell this particular story, they stop at saying, oh, look, it's just a statistical anomaly. It's an artifact. There's nothing going on there. But it actually leads to a new set of questions, and that is, why is it that the programs that men apply to are larger and have more funding so they can accept more people? And it kind of pushes it to the next level, and it creates a drive for more insight. But it is really sort of, again, I think of this hero's journey. We have this narrative, we have discrimination, we're looking at individually, we're not finding anything. We have a statistical artifact. But what does that tell us, and how do we respond most appropriately to it to get the outcome that we really want? And so I think of it as an example of this same paradox.
Well, and what I like about that is a really great data sage or guide could point out that the wrong question is being asked, or that a new question has been raised, because you're talking about, well, if the programs, so you find this paradox and you look, okay, the programs with men are bigger. Well, then why are those programs bigger? That question, why are those programs bigger and what's going on here, isn't something that people were thinking about when they first looked at this data. But if somebody is really insightful about what the data is showing them, they can look at questions in a different way and derive different insights and be a hero.
And by the way, just as an aside, this is one more reason why, for those of you who work with data, having a little bit of domain knowledge about the topic that you're working on is important, to know how things work in that field. I know we like to think that if you take your data and you throw it into a random forest, ta-da, problem solved. But understanding what's going on is always going to make a big difference in terms of, for instance, understanding how educational funding works, and other examples.
Yeah, context matters. So there's this wonderful book, and it's really for fiction writers. It's called Wired for Story. It's all about the neurobiology of stories and how humans react to stories. And one of the great pieces of advice in this book, and this applies to people who are writing novels, I think done properly and safely, it can also apply to data, although I am well aware that we don't want to pull out just one statistic and try and make that tell a whole story. But anywhere that you can find a specific entry point, like the tip of an arrow in a larger story that you have to tell, it gets people engaged. So on generative AI, the dilemma of being the person who's responsible for making sure you're not using any data that you're going to get sued over, the person who's literally sitting at their desk trying to comb through and figure that out, and who has a lawyer on speed dial. That's a very specific way to think about the problems with generative AI. Now, B, please speak to us about how never take one statistic out of context, but is there a tip of the arrow way to think about when you're presenting, especially when you're presenting to business stakeholders? I will always, when I'm doing messaging sessions with clients, I always tell them to think of the Eiffel Tower. So the Eiffel Tower is really skinny until the bottom, and it's sort of an architectural rendering of the Pareto principle. So 80% of your audience can only understand 20% of what you want to tell them.
That's a nice 80-20 version of the 80-20. You know, what I tell, and I've talked about this before in other contexts, is when you are presenting your analyses to your client, you really want to trim down what you're saying, because mostly they had a specific question that they wanted answered when they gave you the project. And the single most important thing, if you say, this is the answer, I actually say you should give the answer on slide 3 of your presentation. And then after that, you justify the answer by showing the relevant things. I usually say, show a graph and then point at the part of the graph that answers that particular part of the question. And if you have a qualification, and go through that. But it is a way also of getting to the point extremely quickly. But what's funny about that is sometimes you give a counterintuitive answer, or there may be resistance. There also may be different groups within the organization who see things differently. And so you may be saying like, and this is what you want to do. And people go like, no, it's not. And that's why you have to then follow through with the data. But the nice thing about that is you have given them this focal point. This is the answer. And now I'm going to explain how I got there. And I do think it gets a little bit more of their attention. And also, if you're going to lose people's interest, if you gave them the answer on slide 3, you probably still have their attention then.
And I think focal point is the right way to describe this. Because some people have a limited capacity to take in information, and they're doing 17 meetings in a day. And so they need to get the distillation. And then if they want to question it and dive in, then you get to let them guide you for how much detail they can hear about and that they want to talk about.
That's also why I say, for instance, when you prepare your presentation, never put tables and numbers in the presentation. You can put them in an appendix at the back of the presentation, but you're just going to show like 5 slides of graphs with arrows saying, look at this, and then say on there why that matters.
Exactly.
But you're getting to the point very, very quickly.
And the happy ending, you know, that happy ending of the curve that we showed in the middle of this presentation, the happy ending is that we know something we didn't know before.
Yep.
So all great stories have a problem. There has to be, if there's no problem, there's no story. It's just like, hi, we work in this field and here's what we do. That's not a story. There has to be a problem that has to be solved. There has to be some detail, some focal point that people can grab onto. There has to be change. The data is either something that demonstrates the change happened, or it's an invitation to change. And then the happy ending or outcome is we get to go in this new direction that the data told us to go in, and we feel good about it. And I want yes, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead with this.
This is our last slide. These are just some resources. So Data Story is written by a woman named Nancy Duarte, who is a Silicon Valley legend. Duarte has been a presentation coach and slide creator and content creator for decades. But Data Story is a book that is specifically written about how to communicate about data. And I think it's a wonderful book. I talked about Wired for Story a little bit, Pixar's book about storytelling. If you want to really get with the OG, Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces is the first book that quantified what the hero's journey looks like. And then if you want to get personal, read the Retellable Story Journal, which is on Amazon, is about if you want to look for the stories in your personal life, the stories in your career that have had meaning for you. So those are several different ways of looking at how story works. Bart, speak to us.
Well, just to follow it up, again, when you do your analyses, remember what's happening usually is you're kind of motoring along in your day-to-day. The company is going along, your client is going along, and then something happens, right? Mm-hmm. So for instance, either they have a really horrible quarter, or they've got there's been an acquisition and things are different, or they're expanding with a new product, or just the opportunity comes up. And I can give you a few examples. Again, these don't have to be, epic level. Some of them are really small. I mentioned in our data charrette, one of the organizations we worked with was a small local museum of art. And their question, now the thing came up that their opportunity came up because I contacted them and say, hey, we're doing this data event. Do you have any data? And they go, well, we do have this. And their question really was, we're open on Sundays, but we don't have a lot of people. Should we continue to be open on Sundays? And I've talked about this example before, but this worked out to be a pivot table problem where we were able to get their attendance by days of the week and by weeks of the month, kind of set it up like the page of a calendar, and find that you really only get attendance. People only show up at your place on Sundays on one Sunday of the month when you're doing outdoor performances. But they don't come in to see the collection. And so it is safe for you to close the collection on Sundays and actually save a lot of money. And without, diminishing your audience's experience. And so we were able to give them this suggestion. It was a small thing. It said close one day a month. Close on Sundays. You will save money. And they did that. That was a simple one. I think of another one. There's an artificial data set that Microsoft prepared that's about a fictional bicycle company called AdventureWorks, and you might be familiar with it. They use it for demonstrating databases. But we did an analysis of that particular data set. We're running through trying to make specific recommendations. And what we were able to show, again, this was done with a pivot table. I did the whole analysis with a pivot table. And what we're able to show is in this data, selling to businesses, B2B businesses, are so unpredictable. And on the whole, you lose money. But the direct to consumer sales, B2C, were uniformly profitable. And from that one, we were able to say, look, the direct to consumers only accounts for 10% of your sales, but it accounts for all of your profits. And so that one's really easy to say, you're going to cut out 90% of your business. The B2B is losing money, and it's losing a lot of money. So again, this is a fictional data set about a company that's making and selling bicycles, but we're able to say, you drop the B2B. It's not paying off for you. And that was one we're able to say, like, you're losing millions of dollars a year by pursuing this low ROI path of sales. By the way, finding stuff like that does make you the hero to the company, because you're able to say, I found a major cash hole and I found a major way to fix it.
Yeah, and if you describe there, people are aware of what the problem was in that instance. They're like, oh, and they understand that there's something wrong. And when there's something wrong, everybody is engaged in how do we solve that problem and get to the other side. John Bass is asking us if this is being recorded, and the answer is yes. Be recorded and
yes, it will. It'll be available on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook almost immediately after this session. So it'll be there.
And the one thing I will say is, if there's no problem to be solved, don't try and invent a problem for the sake of drama. But there are a lot of problems around you that people have really strong feelings about. And if you can anchor to one of those problems, you will get people's attention focused much more than if you don't. And Bart said this earlier, but understanding the context of the business is so important if you're going to define a problem that matters to them. So you need to know what the problem really is and have that empathy.
And so with that, our time is just about up. But I want to say, first off, the recording will be available. And second, you can contact Lisa on LinkedIn and at her company, poseycorp.com. You know what? Let's do this. It is going to be poseycorp.com. Oops, I got to spell it right. And I lost it already.
It's okay. It's in. There's my name right there. Founder of Posey Corp.
I know, it's right there. I just want you to be aware of that. And ta-da, Posey Corp. And then, but also on LinkedIn, where she has a newsletter that comes out regularly. I also have a newsletter, Data is for Doing. Some of you know about it. And I will be discussing some of the elements of what we talked about here, storytelling as it applies to data. So you will have a follow-up, and I will include links to each of the references that she gave in the presentation. So you'll have those available to you too.
Wonderful.
And with that, Lisa, closing words?
Thank you. Tell stories, people. Tell stories and win over people through brain chemistry.
Thanks so much, folks. Thanks for coming. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.